Hello and a very warm welcome back to Widowed AF. You're here with me, I'm your host, and I'm always here with you. I'm Rosie Moss. Now, joining me today, I've got a very exciting guest actually. I've got Josie Jakub on. Now, Josie is the CEO of SOBS, which is the charity called Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide. I had to really think then to make sure I got the letters in the right order, Josie, sorry. Which is incredible. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really, really excited, if that's the right word, to hear about the work that you're doing through the charity, but also about what kind of brought you to the charity, because ultimately it was the loss of your partner, Olivier, to suicide, wasn't it?
It was. Good morning, Rosie. It's great to be
I
here.
launched straight in at
Thanks.
you then, didn't I? There was no preamble. It was, yeah, let's go straight in. Death of your husband, let's go.
That's okay. Storytelling is one of the biggest parts of recovery and grief journey.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, you'll be very aware of this through you put both your own experience and the work that you do. And it is that the conversations around suicide need to happen. We need to talk about it. We need to, because not talking about it isn't stopping it happening. And it's not going to make somebody do something because we have a conversation. And I think as a society, we are very, very scared about talking about all areas of mental health, but particularly around suicide. So I'm always kind of extra grateful to people that are brave enough to come on and share their experiences. So, Josie, I think let's stick with tradition over here. I'm going to get you to just go back and tell me about your relationship with Olivier, what it looked like, because I know that he was French, so there's going to be some interesting aspects there. And then, we'll get to the crux of the issue, and then we'll have a little bit of a chat about the work you do for SOBS.
Yeah, thank you. He was lovely. He'll always be lovely. He was loved by everyone. He was a Buddhist and he
Wow.
liked to grow plants. And he was the opposite to me, which is why I'm sure we got on so well in the beginning. I couldn't keep a plant alive, and Olivier was just, animals would come to him, children would want to be picked up by him. And there was me working in technology, a woman in a man's world trying to smash the glass ceiling, and somehow it worked. He was a long distance lorry driver. And when I moved to Luxembourg to work for a very large retailer where most of us do our Christmas shopping, I decided that I was going to treat not being married and not being engaged as a project, because I was a project manager. So I hired a matchmaker.
Did you?
Which I do not
Oh, you
recommend.
don't? Okay, I was about to make some notes over here.
Do not recommend. No, I got fit. I bought a new wardrobe and I set about joining some dating apps. Now, bearing in mind, this was 2012, the beginning of 2013. And it was a very interesting experience because my profile said no hookups.
Yeah.
And so did his. And that's how we got talking. And yeah, we got talking for about 3 months in, my pidgin French and his excellent English.
Was he based in Luxembourg at the time as well?
Well, he was living in France just over the border, and they reckon that about 500,000 people who work in Luxembourg live over the border, either in France or Germany or Belgium, because it's half the price. It's so expensive in Luxembourg. And he was driving to the airport, Luxembourg Airport, because his long-distance lorry driving job was with Cargo Lux. So when the big cargo aeroplanes landed, and they would be full of bouncing balls or sports cars that were needed for delivery all over the world, they would end up in Dubai via Germany. He would drive these enormous lorries, and he'd pass by my house. I lived near to the airport in Luxembourg, so I got a taste of both countries.
Wow. And I'm just picturing you seeing this enormous lorry go by and having a little wave out the window.
Yeah,
Yeah.
He did do that.
So ultimately, you ended up living together in France, didn't you? So clearly this was a romance that worked, a dating app positive story. They're rare and far between. So what did life look like for the pair of you? Talk to me about a little bit about what your relationship was like.
Oh, it was wonderful. He was from a very traditional French family, so I was the very first person who was English that they'd ever met. And they were all long distance lorry drivers, brother, dad, and they all lived in a really very rural, very beautiful, tiny village in Metz. And I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. Gran and Grandad were there, his brother's wife and their family were there, the brother's wife's parents and their grandparents and their siblings were all in the same village. And it had a church and one tabac and one little bakery, and it was everything that we needed. And actually, we bought some land. We were building our own house in that village. And it was everything I ever wanted. Big family, big French table, whole family get together on a Sunday, eating, drinking all day. Christmas was a 4-day affair.
Um,
And here's me trying to speak French and everyone just being very polite.
were they welcoming?
Somehow we made
Were they
it.
very welcoming?
Very
Yeah.
welcoming.
I mean, as you're
Incredibly.
describing that, you're describing this French village, and I'm thinking of the word village in that kind of the other sense, that sense where we say it takes a village, and this idea that this community
Yes.
of family and extended family are all together helping each other and navigating life
Yes.
together. It kind of gave me goosebumps, actually. It felt really idyllic as you were describing it.
Yeah, it was for me too. I'd spent my whole career since very, very young. My very first job was in telco, a telco telephone company. And so from my first job, and I'm 48 now, I was very transient. I would rent a home to work wherever I was working. Then I would change jobs, I'd change city. I would be work hard, play hard, sales, marketing, business development, everybody out. Great friends, but no
Yeah.
roots. And when I moved to Luxembourg and then ended up with Olivier in France, I'd put down roots for what was the first time in my life.
Lovely. How lovely. But of course, I now know, having briefly spoken to you prior to this, that Olivier died by suicide. And that just doesn't fit this picture that you're painting, does it? This lovely, idyllic,
Yeah.
happy, you described him as amazing, wonderful, loved by everybody. Are you able to talk to me a little bit about, his mental health at this point? Were there any indicators, perhaps, that he was struggling?
I didn't see any indicators, and it was only after his death that his family revealed some of the indicators that they were aware of but ignoring. So when he was 19 years old, and he died when he was 39. So when he was 19, he had an accident in one of the big lorries. His uncle was driving the lorry. Olivier was in a bunk bed, and he ended up going through the front of the lorry window.
Yeah.
He was in a coma. And when he came out of his coma, he was claiming to be able to talk to God.
Gosh.
He understood the matrix of the universe. He could see all the ones and zeros. And he was quickly moved to a psychiatric hospital in France.
Poor guy.
He was there for, yeah, so young. He was there for 2 weeks, and his brother apparently, or his dad, I think it was his dad, signed him out because the opinion was you got to get back on the road, you got to drive, you've got to earn money. He had no talking therapies. He, from what I can tell, only the medication that he left with from the psychiatric hospital. And every year since, he had an episode.
Around the same sort of time,
So
would it be? Oh,
exactly. I
wow.
think he had traumatic brain injury. So from my own research, I believe I've got no evidence to support this, but I believe that his mind, his head, his brain, his accident, he was reliving the trauma every year. And every year between the age of 19 and 39, that trauma became more and more profound. So he managed it himself. He managed it quietly. He was driving. So when he was having episodes, which were mental health, bipolar, he was out driving. So he managed to hide it. So really, the only person who understood that this was a problem was the person he was driving with. Everything else he kept hidden.
What's this sort of the culture around mental health like in France, and particularly at this time? I'm thinking rural France. There's still perhaps kind of a patriarchal side of society, not showing weakness, perhaps men not talking about the mental health. And I'm really hypothesizing here, so please do correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But do you think that perhaps that sort of, get back on the road, put your boots back on again and off you go? Do you think that perhaps that is still problematic, or was certainly problematic at the time? Maybe the lack of encouragement to talk about problems.
I do believe that mental health isn't as advanced in that part of France as it is in other countries. Now, I can only speak to that family, our family, and my personal experience. When Olivier reached the end of his life at 39, he was on a section again. And I visited him every day for the 21 days that he was there. And with my own eyes, I saw that they were being housed in what was really aircraft hangars left over from the war. I can't imagine the difference in the level of care between different countries and where he was at the age of 39. And I can only assume that when he was 19, the level of care was the same or not advanced as that, which was not very advanced.
Yeah, and I mean, we look at the mental health services now and we think, gosh, they're still so broken. But then you look back 20 years and think, God, we have come a long way. Um, what happened then leading up to him being sectioned? What led to that?
Yeah, it was very fast. There really wasn't any signs. We were planning our wedding, we were dating, we'd joined our lives together. There was no signs until probably 2 months or 1 month before he was put on a section. His bipolar had developed further. He was hearing voices and seeing, he was hallucinating, but nobody knew that until after we got the reports after he died. So there was just a day. There was a day where he had disassociation. His mind froze, his mind disassociated from his body for his mind's own protection. So he stood still like a statue. He had his phone in his hand, and his other hand was sort of coming up to his head, and he kind of stopped like this.
Must have been
So
really
yeah,
scary
dissociation.
for you to see that and not be able to reach him. That must have been terrifying.
Yeah, it didn't happen at our house. It happened at his brother's house. So he must have known that something profound was changing within him. Went to see his brother. It happened there. And, the whole family lives in the village. The family was called to the brother's house and he was put, well, they called a doctor and the doctor sent him to a psychiatric ward.
And how was he at that point? I mean, again, forgive me
Yeah.
if I'm overstepping the boundaries here, but I'm just trying to get a kind of insight into what that must have been like. Was he aware that he was being sectioned? Was he frightened?
He seemed still like he was trying to maintain a sense of normality. Don't worry about me, I'll be okay. Giving everybody his details for banks and passwords for things, saying, guys, I'll be in here for a month, but I'll be back. And he was coherent and sunny disposition, positive. We were allowed to visit him. So we went for walks all around the grounds, and he was on some quite strong psychotropic medication, so he was a little bit slower. But he was talking as if, this is something I need, and I just need the right medication, and I'll be back, and looking forward to getting married. And he had a daughter; she was 7 years old at the time. Talking with her, she would come in the visitors' room, and it was all hidden.
And I guess from your perspective, you're thinking kind of scary things happened, but he's in the right place. He's getting support. He's, looking to come home. We're going to carry on our lives. We'll rebuild again. At any point, are you
Yeah.
thinking that you might lose him at this point?
Not
No.
once, and neither was the family. Not once. No. That life was happening around us, and everybody was getting quite a lot of information. As it turned out, somebody who knew the family, a friend of a cousin, actually worked there.
Really?
So we were getting a lot more information than other families, and she was keeping an eye on him. And yeah, the reports coming back from the institution was he's comfortable and well looked after, and he was saying the same. But you look at the place and you know that that can't be completely true, but you're talking to them. And when I picked him up, I put balloons in the
Yeah.
car. It was really inappropriate thinking about it, but it was a celebration. I booked a dinner for us, a really expensive restaurant for the night that he came home. We never went to that restaurant. I think we were all living a completely different reality from him.
You've never experienced this before. You've never done this, and you're just
No idea.
doing the best you can with what you know at the time. Now,
That's right.
Josie, how long was he out of hospital before he ultimately took his own life?
Two
2
weeks.
weeks. And what was it like during those 2 weeks? Can you give me a little bit of an idea of that?
Yeah, we were worried at that point. He put on a lot of weight from the drugs that he was on. He was incoherent for some moments of the day and sleeping a lot.
Was he talking about suicidal ideation? Is this on the radar at all at this point?
No, the family was round at our house. He came back to our house, so he was speaking to a lot of people. He depressed is what I would say. He was crying and sharing with different people, with me, and he just wanted to go back to work. His biggest problem was that he wasn't able to go back to work. He was a driver and he'd been signed off work.
Right. Yeah. Okay. We're getting close now, aren't we? So I'm trying to be sensitive because it's something I want to handle quite sensitively, but I'm also if you're able to tell me about what happened, you obviously only as much as you're comfortable sharing, but what actually happened.
Yeah, it was so unexpected. He was having appointments with his psychologist, that work had given him a psychologist because he told us they had him on a plan to get back to work. He was seeing his family doctor and they were giving him different medications, but he also left the psychiatric hospital with medication from them as well. So he had all these different pills and he didn't understand what to take or when. So we spent hours with pills on the floor trying to sort out the boxes. And then I'd come into the room and all the boxes would be open and all mixed up, and he was upset because he didn't know what he was supposed to take. And that's, in hindsight, when the family and I researched what he was taking, there were some side effects that were very concerning from all of them. So during the day when he wasn't sleeping, he wanted to be outside. He loved the sunshine. He wanted to see his plants. He wanted to go to garden centres. So looking back, we were living a very unusual but doing our best kind of a life. But also looking back, it was very unusual. So he was getting out. He was sitting in the car. He was trying to teach his 7-year-old daughter how to ride a bike. So he was riding around the road that was under the apartment, washing the car, from time to time, at the same time as looking different, had a sense of depression and not smiling as much, the smile never meeting his eyes. And on that last day, he left the house to go and see his psychiatrist, doctor's appointment.
Goodness me. I'm now thinking about his 7-year-old daughter in all of this as well. And
Yeah.
I've got an 8-year-old daughter who I'm also trying to teach to ride a bike. It's enough to drive anyone to drink, that is. But the kind of the juxtaposition, if you like, of the normality of it all. The going to the out and seeing the plants and being with his daughter, and to think what must have perhaps been going on. This emotional turmoil, and
He must have been terrified,
yeah.
yeah. I remember he got very upset because we had a balcony. We also had a kitten, and he shut the balcony door, and the kitten couldn't come back in. And I didn't know. I was out shopping wherever I was, and he was very upset, telling me the kitten was back in the house, but he was sort of admitting this thing had happened, and he didn't understand how it could have happened. There was a similar thing. He took his daughter swimming within those 2 weeks, and there was a point where he didn't know where she was in the swimming pool. And myself and the family were saying, you can't do these things, you have to rest, you have to give yourself time. We were talking about self-care and well-being, but there was so much more going on. But again, just he wanted it to be hidden. I believe he wanted to have his pride. He wanted to get married, and it was 3 weeks, yeah.
3 weeks before your wedding, was it?
Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah, you can kind of sense this man wanting to hold on to normality and his, his life, and not wanting to surrender to whatever is going on in his head. And he's sort of, squash it down, squash it down, squash it down. But ultimately, of course, you
Yeah.
can't do it, can you? Not forever.
Not with the mental health issues that he was having. So, also on the reports from that last psychiatric stay, they had diagnosed schizophrenic episode. So, the bipolar had progressed towards schizophrenia. So, the schizophrenia was showing up in episodes. And he believed that it was going to develop into schizophrenia at some point. And because he was already in the middle, hearing voices and having hallucinations, which they must have been horrible hallucinations, driven by some of the schizophrenia, he thought he was going to be a monster. I think he was scared and very fearful. Schizophrenia means violence. And I think that was one big element of all of this.
And there is nothing more terrifying than being afraid of yourself, is there?
That's
I've
right.
suffered with my mental health, particularly when I hit perimenopause, and I went through a phase where I was, I didn't know what version of me was going to wake up in the morning, and that was really, really scary. And I'm now thinking, the exacerbation of that. If I was waking up thinking, have I got schizophrenia? Am I going to harm somebody? Am I going to
Yeah.
become somebody I don't recognize, and how absolutely frightening that must be. And then to have
Unimaginable.
and then to have a man that perhaps doesn't hasn't perhaps been taught to talk about his feelings, or is scared to talk about his feelings, so it's just going to be percolating round and round and round and round. No wonder that man was terrified, eh?
Absolutely. There were no words for it. He was very, very spiritual, always looking for meaning, the meaning of life, had been touched by mental health from such a young age and had to live with it. He described it once, French, English. We did a lot of things with hands and describing things in creative ways. We had to. It was such a gift. And he described what he was going through as, imagine a television, and when a television breaks, you have a line. You watch the TV with a line down it. And he said, in the early days, his life, his reality, there was a line, and it was black next to the line, but most of the rest was in glorious technicolor. But as he got older and older, the line was of his reality, his sense of reality was moving so that the most amount of space was black, and the reality, the glorious technicolor of reality, was shrinking, smaller and smaller and smaller, until mostly it was all black. Well, that's just unbelievable. Because at the same time, he's a lovely man, and we're going out, we're dancing at people's weddings, and we're planning our own, and he's driving, and he's a dad, and he's a fun boyfriend. We went to Disney World. We went on holidays. We were building a house because he'd had 20 years of hiding it as
Although
well.
you're describing a really tragic and terrifying experience, that description is really, it, let's say, a picture paints a thousand words, if you like. That you can, it gives a kind of tangible sense of what he was going through, because we can all picture that now. You can picture what that must be like to watch your technicolor life begin to shrink and the darkness begin to take over, because when that balance swings too far the other way, it must be incredibly difficult to come back from. Are you able to talk to me a little bit about the immediacy of finding out and afterwards, and what happens next? And there must be some differences in France to how things are in England when something like this happens. And also, I know you'd be
Yeah.
surrounded by his family, but you wouldn't have had your own friends and family from home. So I'm putting words in
Yeah.
your mouth here. You tell me a little bit.
No, that's very accurate. And I've always done things the wrong way round. The police in France carry guns. That's the biggest difference. So that knock at the door, I thought they were Amazon delivering a parcel. I flung the door open and, gestured for them to come in, and come in they did. I was racing around the house. I wasn't aware of anything. I was just trying to get hold of him on the phone. He left in the morning. It was around about 8 o'clock. I was still in bed. I was not working. We'd lost our child, which is why we had the kitten. and he went off to his appointment. And sometimes I would join him, but on this occasion, he said no, he was going to go by himself. And yeah, that morning he left, and he wanted to kiss me goodbye, and I was cross with him, and I just turned and gave him my cheek like a Victorian woman. It was so awful. There was none of this Disney World
No
embrace.
fond
There was none of
farewells
this,
and
big hug. It was, get gone.
yeah,
Kiss me on my
normal
cheek.
life, that right?
Um,
That's
so
normality.
normal line. I was cross because I wasn't going with
Mm.
him, and I was always with him. And he's like, "No, I'm going to do this by myself. We're coming to the end of the appointments, and I'm going to drive over there, and I'm going to pick up some lunch, and I'll be back at 12." One thing he did do that was unusual looking back, we'd agreed that we needed to get the kitten out into the outside world because she's still a cat. She had a harness. We were walking her on a harness, and it was incredibly difficult to get this thing all on her. It was really hard. The clips and through the leg, through the head. I could never do it. So he plopped the kitten on the bed in this harness and said, "You've got to learn how to do it. This is how it is. It's on her. You've got to learn how to do it."
That's
Before I come
interesting.
back to them.
That's
It was so
interesting.
unusual.
And yet, in the same
So
breath,
unusual.
he's talking to you about going to get lunch, and because I was wondering as you were talking, I was wondering, did he know? Was he planning it? Is that why you weren't allowed to go with him? But then you said about him, talking about lunch, and that feels so normal. And actually, I interviewed
Yeah.
a wonderful woman called Lisa, whose husband died by suicide, and he died at a train station, and he'd bought and again the goosebumps. I'm so oversensitive.
Yeah.
He bought coffee and chewing gum, minutes prior, and
Right.
it's that
Yeah.
how the reconciling of that normal behavior with what ultimately
Yeah.
happened. Gosh.
Yeah, if I can interrupt, we hear this a lot. This is one element of it that we'll never know. Even if they were here now and we asked them to explain it, I don't think they could explain it. And with all the hundreds of families that I've personally worked with, so many stories of it happening in the moment. For example, people just stepped off the bus,
Mhm.
rang the bell and got off the bus. Or many people lost loved ones, they were at a party. They were at a dinner table. They excused themselves to go to the loo and never came back. Really, really in the moment. I'm sure it is. I know it's different for a lot of people. Other people's loved ones, it's more considered. But I personally believe it's very chemical. Something snaps. And I don't have those chemical changes or imbalances within me. My chemical disposition is different. I think something snapped. We don't talk about method at SOBS, and I'm not going to talk about method, but his car was on in the place where it was, and he just turned off the engine and got out the car and left the door open, and it was in the middle of a highway. And I think he just decided right there and then. But I don't think you decide. I think you don't do this weighing up in the moment. All the weighing up might happen years or months before, but he got out of his car on a very, very busy highway, left the door open, and that was
I
it.
think that's probably the thing that terrifies people most, isn't it? It's that it can happen in that split second. If somebody has been talking about, deep depression, about, thinking I can't carry on, I'm having this ideation, then not that you understand, but there is I guess some level of understanding, because you're thinking, well, this person was living with this terrible, feelings and demons in their head. But when it happens like that, so suddenly,
Yeah,
I suppose it brings it home that none of us are immune. None of us are immune from
yeah,
either having these feelings or loving somebody who does. And I think, again,
yeah,
we mentioned earlier, but that is why it's so important to talk about it, because
yeah,
it happens, and it happens more often than we'd like, really. Let's be honest.
yeah, yeah. And I think he did fully intend to come home and have lunch, because there was 13 other days within that 2-week period where that's exactly what
Yeah.
happened. But something was different that day. And then after he died, we started to get letters from the courts. He had kept a big secret. There was one episode that he had where he'd taken a double articulated lorry from work when he wasn't on a shift, so stolen it, and he was driving at 200 kilometers an hour on a French highway, and was snapped by two cameras. So he'd maintained a speed of 200 kilometers across two cameras. So he was going to court for that. He could have gone to prison for that.
You
He definitely wouldn't have been able to go back to
and you
work.
had no idea.
We had no idea.
So the police, the armed police, have come to your house. Are you? Can you speak good French at this point?
I could, but not on subjects like that.
And probably not in
So
moments of extreme emotion as well.
that's right. Yeah. I couldn't understand what they were saying. I think they assumed, as anybody would, they were entering a house in rural France where the person was French. I don't know whether they expected to see anybody. I think at that point they were trying to identify. So they'd found his address and went to it to see what was what, and there was me. So yeah, they were talking incredibly quickly. There was two of them. They made me sit on the sofa, but I wouldn't sit because I was running around trying to phone him at that point. I was it was way past 12 o'clock and I couldn't get hold of him. So I was frantically trying to use the house phone and trying to use my mobile, trying to change the SIM card in my mobile to a different SIM card because my phone wasn't connecting with him. That's because his phone was off. But I had no idea. I was just frantically trying to understand why I couldn't connect to him. Never once did I think his phone was off. So the police, sit down, asseyez-vous, madame. And I wouldn't. And they got a bit cross. And the only word I could understand was décider, which is death. But they were not saying it gently. That nobody sat next to me. There was no
Arm around the shoulder.
liaison officer. Yeah, and no one that could speak English. I was yelling at that point. I have to use the telephone. Where is Olivier? And they weren't saying Olivier, Monsieur Décidé. They were just saying that. I think they were saying there has been a death. Well, that's got nothing to do with me.
Nothing to do with
No,
Olivier.
I kind of thought there must be a fire in the building. I didn't know why they were there. I had things to do. I was trying to phone Olivier.
Yeah.
And they were getting in the way of that. And it was very confusing, very confusing. And I wasn't meeting their eyes. I was, sitting on the sofa, which they made me do, and just staring at their massive boots and the guns that were down by their legs, and it was all just so bizarre. And then one of them picked up the house phone, and I lost it because I needed the house phone to connect to Olivier, and there was this man, a gendarmerie, on the telephone that I needed to use. Oh my god, it was yelling. You shouldn't really yell to a French policeman with a gun.
I think in the gun.
Was.
But you don't care in that moment, do you? Because you'd be so frantically bargaining and trying to find a way that this wasn't true as well. Last thing you want to do.
And you're subconscious and you're conscious. I think consciously you know what's going on, but subconsciously you really don't.
Anything
and then
else?
you can't.
Anything else? Anything other than
That's
that?
right.
So did family come to you at this point and help sort of interpret?
No, I had a French policeman back at the French police station on the end of the phone. And I don't know who he was. I don't know what his role was, but maybe it was their boss, somebody they knew back at the station that could speak some English. So he delivered the news dreadfully because he could speak partial English. And I don't know what he said, but I sort of was hearing that Olivier might have been in an accident. But at the same time, I was hearing the word Décidé and I was not putting it together. So they had to say it over and over. So the delivery of that was awful because I couldn't understand. So then I had two men and a man on the phone, and they were all trying to say, he's dead.
All shouting the word dead in French at you.
Yeah, really, and getting very cross with me. So there was no compassion. And I was just yelling at them saying, where is he? Thinking he'd been held for an accident.
Or in hospital. I'll still love him without legs. All of those sorts of things going through your head.
But at the same time, none of those things, because you flight or fight, aren't you? And I was doing a bit of both.
Freeze, a bit of fawn, anything, chuck it
Yeah.
all in.
Yeah. And then they left. Oh, they tore off a piece of paper from a leaflet that was hanging around next to the television. They tore off a piece of paper, wrote a telephone number in French, which turned out to be the man on the phone, and they
Oh
left.
my, so you're just sitting in your apartment.
I was just sitting with that news. What I thought was that news. It
You're
was
not even
the
sure.
most surreal experience. I wasn't sure, but the weight, the one thing I can remember amongst all the chaos was the weight of having that information that nobody else knew.
Yeah, God, I remember that. I remember that being the only person that knows and knowing that you're going to have to impart this information, break hearts, shatter lives, and that's an enormous weight, an enormous weight. Who was the
Yeah.
first person you called?
My
Of
mom,
course.
yeah,
Oh, we're
yeah.
lucky.
She was living in
Oh, she
France,
was in France.
yeah,
Oh God,
but
that's good.
very, very far south, very south. Carcassonne. She was Limoux, an hour away from Carcassonne. And I was near Metz, which is in the middle, an hour away from Paris, and she was right down here. And I said, the police have just been to the house. I think Olivier's died. My mum knew because obviously to outsiders looking in, he'd been on a section. He was hearing voices and paranoia and not acting right, and everyone was coming along the journey with me. So I think she knew what was what. So she just said, I'm going to get your dad. We're going to get in the car. We're going to come right now. It took her 10 hours to drive. They didn't even pack a bag. They just literally got in a car. It was the nicest
You
thing.
know what? My parents were on holiday in Cuba and they weren't in a resort, a tourist resort. They'd gone, they're having these middle-aged, wandering holidays where they go off on adventures, and they had to be reached by the embassy, and they did the same thing. They flew back. They had to pay for, I think it might even have been a first class ticket. I mean, I think it nearly bankrupted them getting home. But they came home. My dad went home and locked the house up. My mum came straight to me. He packed a bag of clothes, and I just think, God, there are people out there that don't have that. And imagine that. Imagine having to go through that without having the backup of your parents. I'm so glad that yours were there and they were able to get you, but I bet that was a bloody long 10 hours.
It was, but I was with Olivier's
They
family.
rallied round, did
And
they?
yeah, I remember, what clothes do you wear to tell somebody's parents that they've died, not knowing if they had, and setting off that bomb. And another thing, the flashbacks, you just remember points in time. I was pulling clothes out of the wardrobe and getting dressed, and then changing my mind and getting dressed into something else, and changing my mind and getting dressed in something else, not knowing what on earth to wear. And I had to drive. I had to drive 45 minutes down a busy motorway to get to his parents' house, because our apartment wasn't in their village at that point. We were building a house in that village, but we were in an apartment 45 minutes away. So I had to drive. What a stupid thing to do, but I could not keep that news. I had to give that piece of paper to someone and pass the ball
And somebody that spoke the
and
language
find
as well,
out.
somebody that could find out what was
Yeah.
going on. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
because he was meant to be like, where was he? That was all that was going around. Where is he? Where is he?
Isn't it incredible
Yeah.
that the way your mind sort of protects you, the fact that you were even able to get into a car and remember how to put it in gear.
Unbelievable.
I
Yeah.
can re- I can remember
Unbelievable.
the police being there, and I'd just got out of the bath with the kids, and I had my pajamas on, but I didn't have a bra on. And all I can remember thinking is, they're telling me my husband is presumed dead, and I haven't got a bra on. And it's
Yeah.
all I could think about. I was fixated. I need to go and put a bra on. I
Yeah.
need to do that.
Yeah.
And it was
Well, that's vulnerability, isn't it, as well? How
probably, and trying to
horrendous.
find something that is normal. This is a normal thing to do. I'll go upstairs and put a t-shirt and a bra on, and I'll make them a cup of tea. And I remember being in the
Yeah.
kitchen making this tea and just losing it. Just the reality of it just landing, and I was like, "What the fuck am I doing? I'm making a cup of tea
Yeah.
when my husband is out in the channel, presumed dead."
Yeah.
But you just go
Yeah.
into autopilot. I mean, I
Yeah.
could ask you how his parents and family reacted, but I probably know the answer. I mean, and it's just horrendous, absolutely horrendous. When when I had to tell Ben's mum, I rang her because she lived on the Isle of Wight, and I rang his brother first, and I said, "You got to go sit with your mum." And he's like, What is it?" I'm like, "I can't tell you. I need to tell your mum first, and just trust me on this one." And it's just that,
Yeah.
oh God, I'm going to break her heart, and you feel
Yeah.
somehow responsible, not because it was your fault, but because you're the one imparting the
The
news.
messenger.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much. Definitely. Yeah. Very sad. Very confusing. You watch The Bill. That shows my age, doesn't it?
I
You
do.
watch TV and they've got people with them and they've got tea made and
Yeah.
for them by other people and tissues, and it just wasn't like that. Everybody was grieving in their own language, a different language, and nobody understood mine.
What was it like when your parents got there? Just tell me about that moment when the car pulls up and you see them.
I really don't
You
remember
don't.
it. We were all in Olivier's parents' house, and at that point, the entire village was there. And I think that my parents came directly to Olivier's parents' house because that's where we all were. We were all trying to piece together any fragments of information. And new people were coming all the time. And eventually, his sister came from work, and then there was different neighbours, and everyone was sharing things. And then the police was sharing more information, and the dad and brother had to identify the body, and then they came back with more information, and nobody left the parents' house. I can't remember my mum and dad arriving, and I can't remember how I got back to the apartment where my parents stayed. And then my brother flew out, and then my friends flew out. We were all in Olivier's apartment at different times. But I think that's where I did my collapsing, and that's where I did my just time passed. I can't, I don't know the details of
The same. And
any of that. It was a
there's bits
blur.
of it that they kind of seared into your mind, little aspects of it. But when you think this is the day my husband died, why don't I remember the police officers' faces? I'm fairly certain it was a man and a woman, but that's as much as I've got. And you think these are the people that imparted this news to me. You'd think I would know their names, their badge number, you name it, but I don't at all.
Yeah.
They're a blur. So you were just a couple of weeks away from getting married, weren't you? So in the
Yeah.
eyes
Yeah.
of the law back then in the UK and presumably in France, you are not married, obviously. But I know when we spoke prior to having the recording, you said that there was a kind of a loophole, if you like, in French law, like a bit of a hangover from the war, where if you are planning to be married, in fact, I'll let you tell it because you'll know it in much more detail than me.
Yeah. This is my mum
Good old
again.
mum.
Love your mum. She was Googling at the apartment what the traditions, rituals, and traditions were around a French funeral. We had no idea. We didn't know if we were supposed to put a note on the door or wear black or what we were supposed to do or how to tell or who to tell, anything. And while she was Googling how to support my daughter through bereavement and what is a French funeral, she came across this law. And it had never changed, never gone away since the war. And it said if your wedding was in plan, it was being planned, was in progress, when one of the spouses died, you could marry posthumously with the permission of France, the President of France.
Which is quite sweet, isn't it? And one of these
Lovely.
quirks that you never would come across unless you find yourself in this circumstance. So presumably that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to be married to him. So you
Absolutely.
start the
Yeah.
process.
It was so devastating anyway, and every single day was a blur. Horrific physical, emotional, psychological impacts of grief. And my mum knew that this would be a project. She knew it would be a focus, and she knew it would be something, if you can't eat, I couldn't eat. If you can't sleep, I
No.
couldn't sleep. I couldn't hear anything. The impact of the emotion made me quite deaf. But she knew I could focus on this, and it would be the one thing that I would say yes to. So there was so much devastation, but knowing that he would be celibate, he would be recorded as celibate when he died was horrible for me. And I didn't want to be recorded as celibate when I died either. So I wanted to fix
What's
that.
that then? The recording is celibate. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah. Not celibate as in never having sexual relations, but a single person. Yeah, the word,
Yeah,
the
it's
French
quite
word.
a quite a, an uncomfortable word actually. When you're thinking you're actually in a
Incredibly.
loving relationship, and
Yeah, the love of my life.
yeah,
I was really old when I found the one, and I wanted to be
yeah.
married to
Yeah,
him.
I know people that have
You know,
taken their late partner's surname posthumously because they want to feel that connection to them, and often if they've got children, it kind of helps with the family dynamic, the name.
yeah,
But to actually to find out that there is a possibility that you can become legally married after his death,
yeah.
I think your mum,
Oh, it was
stroke of genius of
joyous.
your mum as well, to give you
It
something to
wasn't
focus
it,
on. I mean,
wasn't it? It was such a light at the end of the tunnel. Um, she looked into the process. It was very complex and it took a long time, but she needed it to be. My mum, retired, came from a long line of teachers. Mum was one of six. All my aunties and uncles are teachers. Gran and granddad were headmaster and headmistress when they were alive, and everyone loves a project. So here's your next one. 50 people on average, 50 French people on average, apply for a posthumous marriage every year in France, and 1%, less than 1%, get given a yes. So the odds were incredibly low, but it really wasn't about the end result. It was about the focus and pulling me out of this dark, dark place. So she said, you have to prove that he is who you said he is, that you are who you say you are, and that you were in love, because you can't go marrying any old dead person.
no, you've got to prove that you're in love, which is quite a difficult thing to prove, I would imagine.
Very difficult, but
So, how,
like challenge.
so what did you do?
So I wrote letters. I spent hours, nights, days writing letters in French to everybody who knew us, everybody that was a part of the wedding, the bridesmaids, the cake decorators, the entertainment, the venue. Submitting photographs. We had to create a dossier, a packet of evidence. Photographs that we took when we went to try on his suit and my wedding dress, and all the evidence that we had paid, registered to go to wedding shows. So it was letters and photographs. And so it was evidence from the people, it was their sworn testimony. So I had to ask, this is what I'm doing, this is why I would like to do it, this is why I would like to be married posthumously. All this explained in very individual letters. The letter I wrote to Gran and Grandad was very different to the letter I wrote to the balloon animal maker.
It's not a copy paste job. And were you emailing them or were you pen to paper?
Pen to
Pen to
paper,
paper.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
And what?
Yeah, it took hours and it was great. It took so long. And what nobody expected, ever, nobody expected to get letters back. And really, that's what saved me.
Tell me about
That's
these
so healing.
letters.
Oh, beautiful. I was back in Brighton. I stayed in France until the November, and he died in the March. So I came to Brighton and I got my first letter delivered to my house here in Brighton, and I couldn't understand it. All my French had gone out the window. For some reason, that part of my brain has been locked away now. So I hired a translator. I put a little notice on our community notice board, explained it might be,
Of
harrowing
read.
content. Yeah, and somebody wonderful. I can't even remember who she is
Um,
now. All that part of 9 years ago, gone. And she stayed with me. She came into the apartment and she read the letters and translated for me and wrote down the translations, and so validating. I'm sure, I don't know, I was just about to say, I'm sure you felt it too, but maybe you didn't, so I apologize. But my partner dying, the first thing you think of is, why didn't he love me enough
yeah.
to stay alive?
Yeah, especially in the
So when you get,
circumstances of
yeah,
Olivier's death as well. Um,
yeah,
I'm picturing you like with this interpreter reading these letters and all those emotions that must have been coming out, and
oh, it was
to think about
joyous,
how other people viewed
incredible.
you as a couple. I mean, what
Yeah,
can you call it, a gift? I guess it is a gift, isn't it?
it is a gift, yeah. To read from, the Mary of the village, these very traditional men. Again, they'd never met an English person. And to have the head of the household in France, in all the French families, the letters back were from the men. So these male handwriting and the validation that he did love me, actually. And then your mind can't play tricks on you anymore because it's there in black and
Tangible
white.
evidence, and that people have
So
taken
healing.
the time to do it. In a world where we
Yeah,
communicate via text and email, and it's all very quick and
yeah.
instant. I love the idea of you putting pen to paper, and then of people then reciprocating and doing it too.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah. But even people like, you buy cake
Yeah.
toppers, such a small thing. They wrote one of the longest letters. And you're like, wow, this really was something beautiful. And so all that trauma and all that PTSD gets replaced with love again.
What did you do with the letters? Have you kept them in a file or a album or something?
I sent them off to France. The president of France has got them. So that's the saddest thing. I did take a photocopy of everything before I had to pack it up. You have to work with a British consulate, and out of all the British legal, the lawyers, there was a list of only 10 approved by France government for this process. So you have to work with the consulate and one of these 10 approved lawyers, and then they have the box, they have the letters, and the lawyer, you have to pay a lawyer to send the box to the first person at the bottom of the chain between the janitor and Macron. And then you have to pay, and the person at that level has to say yes or no, we or no. And if he says we, I believe you, and signs, it goes back to the lawyer.
Right.
Then the lawyer sends it to the next
Oh
person
my
in the
God,
chain.
stop
You
it.
pay. And then you pay again, and you keep paying. And you're like, this is so expensive, but the more I'm paying, the
That's
closer
right. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
getting to it. And you don't know, they don't tell you how many people are in that chain, and they don't tell you how long it's going to take. So I just kept being invoiced. And 4 years later, Macron had received the box. He's never sent it back, but again, I've got the photocopies.
And what was the outcome?
No,
No.
he said
So you
no.
went all the way
Yeah,
up the chain, got as far as Macron, and then a no.
yeah. But at that point, it wasn't about, I would still love to do it. It still matters. I really, really, really believe I want to be his wife. I feel like I'm his wife in my heart, but still, it's not the point. He could have said yes. He said no. But I was a different person because of the process. So it was devastating, but the whole thing, that going through it was the
Gift that it
point.
gave you.
He wrote a letter, a very official, again, very not compassionate. None of this was compassionate at all. His letter said, I said no to a Belgian woman living in France. So if I said no to her, why would I say yes to an English woman living in France? So I'm not going to say no to
Yeah.
yes to you because I said no to
Bit
her.
anti-British, isn't it?
And that was
From our
that.
French
Yeah,
cousins.
we as well. Exactly.
And you don't feel any kind of resentment or anger towards France or the process or even Macron himself?
I don't. I don't feel any anger towards Olivier or what happened. It changed me as a person. It changes everybody. How could it not? Changes your DNA, your wiring. The whole thing I'm at peace with. I couldn't, there is no anger about any of it. It would be very unusual to have any anger amongst all this peace. However, I do think that his reasoning and his justification was a little bit off. And as a person that really believes in justice, I feel very strongly that one day I would like to appeal.
Yeah.
And when I don't work in the third sector and I've got a bit more money behind me, I would like to take it a bit further and try again.
Let me know if you do. I'll come with my placard or something and cheer you on.
Will
Yeah, I
you?
will.
Thank you. We chain ourselves
To
to
Macron's
the
garden.
French consulate.
Let's go to France. Have a trip to
Yeah,
France out of it while we're in.
why not?
So let's just talk a little bit then about how you came across the charity SOBS. So I'm just reiterate what it was. I did say at the beginning, it's Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide. So how did you
Yeah.
come across them?
Yeah, I was on Google, and at that point in the November, when I was in my little apartment in Brighton with the cat, just Googling what can I do for my own self-care. I was actually looking for bereavement counselling and it came up, SOBS bereavement group. And I thought, yeah, I can do that. So I called and I spoke to an incredibly lovely lady, Paula, who started the Brighton group. Her mum lives in my village. We're still very close, very good friends. And she was so lovely on the phone. It was all the compassion I could have done with, a year ago at that point. And she's just explaining about peer support and the power of being in a room just for an hour with people who've lived it too.
Yeah.
And she just said, come along, see what you think. And I did.
And I've just written down the word compassion there because particularly after the experience you had of hearing about the death of Olivier in such a kind of depersonalized way, that compassion is everything. And again, I'm going to just a little bit from my story, but I was trying to get help for my kids, and I was getting stonewalled. Nobody would help me. Nobody. There was nothing there. And there's a really lovely small charity near me called Holding On Letting Go. And my mum found the number. She would ring and then she'd pass the phone to me. And this wonderful lady, Debbie, her name is, and she just said to me, we're going to help you. We're here. We're going to help you. And even saying that now, I can feel my eyes prickling because the thought that somebody was going to do something to support us. And they've been, a bit like you, but maybe not quite to the same extreme. I've done some volunteering for them. I'm not the CEO yet. Maybe we'll work up to that. But it's something so magical and special about the peer support and about feeling like somebody's going to hold your hand through this process a little bit and just be with you.
That's it. It's very incredible to be even with one person that says, I know, I understand, that happened to me. Even our conversation, when I read your book, your book, so healing, so helpful. There's something transformational happens when you're hearing from someone who's walked that path and lived that grief and understands because it happened to them. There's all the well-meaning people in the world, my family, my friends, his family, and I wouldn't change it, and they had their part to play. But when I went to SOBS, it changed everything. Suddenly the grief journey, the healing was miraculous.
Found your tribe.
Exactly, found your tribe. They're my very best friends even today. And it was a lot of the older ladies, to be honest, scooped me up. The 70, 60, 70-year-old, it's a couple of 80-year-olds, yeah, doing their knitting in the peer group. And then they came and did cat sitting for Mimi. And I had a very strong psychological response around that kitten. I couldn't leave her alone. I thought she was going to die. I thought she was going to get stolen. I was trying to do this job in London when I came back to England, and I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't go to the station. And it was Maureen. It was one of the older ladies from SOBS that was in the house saying, go to the station. And I would leave and she'd like, I know you're there. Go down the stairs. And then I'd go outside and she'd open the window and I'd be sitting on the doorstep. Go to the station. And Mimi's fine.
But I couldn't do it. But it is interesting how we project that fear onto things like pets. So we've recently got a new kitten, Bean. He's gorgeous. And I am just, my head, I'm obsessed with the fact he's going to die. We're going to come home and find that he's fallen into the toilet. So I'm going around closing the toilet lids and, I just think nothing feels safe anymore. Even 8 years in, and I've done all the work and all the therapy and all the, breath work.
That's right.
And still there is that underlying fear that something terrible is going to happen.
That's right. That's a very real thing. We had a couple of burglaries where I live and I lost it. But all the neighbours know I couldn't be in a nicer place, a nicer community. But you do. And it's something about the man you loved, the one that that protective layer missing, that vulnerability is very profound. And we're strong, independent, incredibly resilient women. But there's something there. There's something there about safety.
Yeah. And also the realization that the world isn't fair, that a terrible thing can happen without you having any build up, any warning. And the thought that it might happen again, something else terrible. You're not immune from terrible things now.
Yeah.
Let's just go back to your work at SOBS a little bit more, because I'm just really interested in how you went from attending the peer support groups, meeting lovely people like Maureen, to actually going to work for them. Did you start off volunteering?
I did. Yeah, I did. I started off not being able to speak through the tears. It was a good few months, probably 6 months, maybe longer, where I just couldn't say any words at all. I was just listening. And then, like a flower that blooms after winter, some of the beautiful flowers that come up through that hard earth, I started to share and I started to come to life. And, it's been 9 years. He died in 2017. I started to do the tea and coffee, very
Yeah.
British, put in the
Give,
biscuits,
give
the
me a
soft
job.
biscuits on the saucer. I wanted to put the leaflets out and the books out because they really became my life. It's funny, people disappear from your life, but the people at SOBS became my life. And I wanted to do more. So I got trained. I was doing tea and coffee. Then I got some training to be a volunteer. I was an unofficial volunteer. I wanted a badge
Yeah,
on,
yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to speak. I wanted to be a facilitator. And so I was doing that for a little while, 3 or 4 years. And then Paula said, the leader of the group who started the Brighton group, she said she was leaving because she was working with baby charities, baby loss. And she said, I'd like you to take over and be the lead volunteer. There's always three who have to organise the group. We got about 30 people coming, 30 members, but you always needed three volunteers. And so she passed the baton to me. And I did that, and I'm still doing
So
that.
are you?
And it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah. And I was working as well. I had a couple of jobs in those 9 years. London, some hybrid working, office, technology, still in technology, but going to SOBS and passing on what I knew from my journey, my healing, my grief, passing on to the newly bereaved, and organising events and fundraisers and just opening up that space to hear how it was for everybody and share how it is for us now.
There is something incredibly healing about working within the grief sphere, about using this trauma. And this is not, saying, oh, we're so worthy and we're so good. We've given so much back, because actually I sometimes think that it's quite selfish what I do, because I get so much back from it. That sense of
Yeah.
knowing that there's a lovely term one of my guests used, grief Sherpa. This idea that you walk through the fires of hell and then you turn around and you hold a hand out to somebody else and you guide them through. Because without the grief Sherpas that helped me at the beginning, I don't know how I would have got through. So it's actually quite
Yeah.
an honour to go back and do this for other people.
Yeah.
It does take a toll, I think, as well. And I'm wondering how, and I'm aware I've kept you for quite a while, so I won't ask you too many more questions, but I've just how you've managed your own kind of mental health and your own capacity, if you like, whilst processing your grief, but also guiding other people through.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. I love Grief Sherpa, whoever
Great, isn't
came up
it?
with that gold
It's
star.
great. I've
I
stolen
love
it.
that. It's good. It is the storytelling. It is the fact that I can keep Olivier's memory alive. It's the fact that I can go back to that place. I did have EMDR trauma therapy in France for a number of months, and that was significant. That allows me to tell my story without being as impacted by the grief as other people and as I was in the early stages. However, it's working in a peer support environment that allows me to share my story over and over for 9 years, that I'm okay talking about what happened. It's important to say what happened to me so that it encourages other people or creates that space where it's okay for other people to say, I've lost someone
Yeah.
too. So it is healing. And spiritually, we're keeping Olivier's name and his story alive, and it keeps our love alive. And as long as I feel love, then I'm not feeling the grief that I felt in the first few years. And so self-care for me, it looks like working in the community, the parish council, the road safety, working, with SOBS is amazing. It's so fulfilling. Writing and just having a relationship with God, all those things all at the same time.
Yeah.
Feeding the birds on the bird table, bringing up my kitten, who's now nearly a 10-year-old cat.
Do you know, I didn't want to ask if the cat was still around. I thought I'm not going to ask just in
Yeah, I'm
case.
surprised you've not seen her on the sofa.
I've got one in here somewhere actually. I've not got the kitten,
Do
but I've got the
you?
bigger one and the rag doll. She's normally you just see a fluffy tail go past.
Yeah,
So you've built yourself a new life, a new version of your life,
I
and
have.
you've
Yeah.
sought out community and support, and then you've offered it back. And I do think that is one of the real fundamental kind of pillars of healing. Have you got any advice, I suppose, either from your professional or your personal experience, if you are talking to somebody who perhaps has lost somebody to suicide and does feel really isolated and they're battling with, outside views and, how to tell the children perhaps, presumably the first place that you'd suggest they go would be to SOBS, and absolutely you should, and I'll put lots of links in and details in the show notes. But is there any kind of, I don't know, and I really put you on the spot as well, but is there anything
No, it's
you would want to
okay.
say to those people at this early point in their journey?
Yeah. Yeah. With children, obviously, Papyrus, Winston's Wish, and Child Bereavement UK are great organisations to help with how to tell your children and young people about a death and how to work with them after you've told them about a death. And honesty is always the best policy. For adults 18 years or over, SOBS, we support people on their grief journey. We prevent the isolation that you do feel. Even when you're surrounded by friends and family, they're not living what you've lived. Siblings live it different to parents who live it differently to spouses. So we do recommend SOBS that goes alongside whatever counselling and psychology and support you're receiving from other places. But in terms of advice, I'm going to quote one of our incredible volunteers on our support line. He's a father, he lost his son. His name is Nigel Lineker. He's created the grief opera. Please Google
I'm
it.
just writing it down.
Please Google the grief opera. And he teaches something incredibly wonderful. We mourn the lives we've lost. We mourn the people that we were when our loved ones were around. And that's okay. And we should mourn that loss because that person has gone. That person within us has gone. Will never be the same. But we have to rebuild. We have to have hope for the person that we are after we lost our loved ones. So that new identity is hope. That new identity is new. It's not what we lost. It's what we rebuild now that's important.
Yeah, it's very, very true because I talk quite a lot about the choice, and it feels like a really simple choice. Do I keep going or do I give up? But actually, giving up means losing everything. It means becoming isolated. It means, not finding joy and adventure and beautiful things out in the world. And sometimes that might feel really, really daunting when you're grieving, that I don't want to choose the beautiful things in the wonderful world. But as time goes
Well,
on,
we
no,
can't. We're in too much
yeah,
trauma. But
little
eventually,
glimmers start
you
to appear,
know,
don't they? You
that's
might say, "Oh,
right.
actually, look at that sky today. It's so beautiful and blue." And then you think, "Oh no, I'm grieving. I'm not meant to think that." But it finds
Yeah.
a way of creeping back in if you're open to letting it. And it's a tough choice. And I say as well, you've got to do the work, and it's called doing the work because
Yeah.
it's hard, and you're not going to heal without doing it. You've got to get outside, you've got to
Yeah.
talk, whether it's to a therapist, whether it's to the sky, whether it's to God, whoever it may be, you've got to talk
Yeah.
about it. And I think what you're doing and what the charity is doing around talking about suicide is making everything feel less hidden, less, and that lovely expression about shame
Yes.
can't live in the dark if you shine a light on it. And so we take away that shame and
That's
that
right.
stigma around suicide, and we see it for what it is, which is mental illness, and to be treated as
Yeah.
such, not as because. And actually, I'm just going to ask you really quickly because this is something that does come up, and again, feel free to tell me to bugger off if you like, but this idea of suicide being selfish, of being a choice, how do you respond to people that, again, professionally or personally, that perhaps have that view on
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Isn't it amazing how many times we hear people say that? And very often people say that to be helpful. And it really is a judgment that they can't filter. It comes
Mm.
out of their mouths so many times. I do not believe, not for a second, that it's selfish. I believe that Olivier did a very selfless act. He didn't want to become a monster. He didn't want to become a violent schizophrenic, whether that, I know it can be treated. I don't think it was selfish. I don't think suicide in general is selfish. I can't explain it, but I don't think it's a decision. I think it's very chemical. I think it's a side effect of medication. It's a side effect of very common medications that we take all the
Often
time.
for depression as well, which is the scary thing, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, I've got some big issues with pharmaceutical companies around it. So I personally don't believe it's selfish. I believe that in our collective consciousness, we're still having a hangover from committed suicide, which was an illegal act. It was illegal to self-murder, which is what suicide used to be all about. And I think that's possibly where some of this instant judgment comes from around saying how selfish.
Perhaps some
I think if
fear.
we understood more, definitely fear, certainly judgment, a lot because it hasn't happened to the people saying it. If they had experienced it too, they would have a different opinion. They wouldn't say it. It's the way it's portrayed on TV dramas.
Yeah.
And again, it's in the collective consciousness. We're not talking about suicide enough yet, that the narrative is not building a compassionate language. And I do think it's a reaction, and I don't believe it's selfish.
I wonder as well if people sort of say it's selfish to, in their mind, perhaps put people off doing it. That's their way of sort of saying, no, this is a bad thing. I mean, I don't know. I think we just, I tell you, as a mother of, I've got 2 teenage boys now and a younger daughter, and a friend of mine, their son died by suicide. And when we moved into this house, we've got beams in the top floor bedrooms. And I found myself thinking, what if? What if?
Yeah.
And of course, my son has never shown any ideation. He's very emotionally well balanced. He's had lots of support. But it's that fear. It's that primal fear right in your soul. And I just think, I don't know. I don't even know why I'm sharing that with you. I guess, just to sort of show that even somebody that's quite well versed in mental health can still have that irrational terror around suicide and the idea that it might happen in your world. And of course it might. I mean, I really hope it won't happen in my world, but I don't know what the future holds. And I know friends who've lost partners to suicide, and it has been, terrible for them. Anyway,
I think that's a very normal feeling. I've spoken to lots of families and lots of women, mothers and grandmothers, who have that same feeling. It goes back to what you said earlier. The worst has already happened. So we can no longer rationalize in our minds. We can no longer convince ourselves that it won't happen, because once it did, so why not? We've been exposed. This is where PTSD comes in. We've been exposed to such a lot of trauma that now we're wired differently. In that sense, our mind is going to cross those thoughts.
And that lovely quote that you read about grieving the person you used to be. I actually did a post on social media, I think it was last week, about grieving the mother I used to be. But I tell you what, I also really miss the naive person I used to be, the person that thought that, you behave decently, the world will be kind back to you. That bad things happen to other people, that I'm safe, and I miss her. I miss that naivety. But I also do genuinely think I wouldn't have built WAF. I wouldn't have made some of the incredible friends I've made. And you've got to, I'd have Ben back in exchange for it all. Of course I would. But you've got to try and find those positives and look what's happened since, and try not to live under that fear, that cloud of fear, which is easier said than done. And it takes work. We've got to do the work.
Yeah, it takes work. It takes time as well. So everything that we're saying is true, but probably not in the first year. And anyone that's supporting somebody bereaved by suicide, bereaved by any kind of death, support them to come back to life in their own time. It is important to talk and share and see counsellors and go back to work if they're able to, because the grief journey and healing is really important, but people do it faster and slower than others. And doing the work is a lifelong pursuit.
Do you remember you see the stages of grief, and I was like, right, all I got to do, get through those, get to acceptance, tick, I'll be healed. Silly me, right? Silly me. Josie, it has been really, really incredible talking to you today, and I could probably go on for another hour quite comfortably, but I'll refrain from doing that to you. Is there anything else that you wanted to share? Anything you wanted to say before we wrap up?
Just thank you. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for the amazing book that you've written that certainly was a beacon of light for me. Thank you for anyone who is going to be brave enough to say the word suicide, because we've spoken and used that word a lot today. And if anybody you know is bereaved by suicide, even if it was years ago, mention about SOBS. We've got groups all over the country, from Scotland to Cornwall. We've got a support line if you want one-to-one individual support, and we provide support by email as well, which is very discreet. And we've got a forum, an online forum, but nobody's heard of us. So tell a friend.
Well, and I certainly will. I will mention you in the show notes, and we'll tag SOBS in any clips as well, because you're right. People don't know it's there because they don't need it, and then when they need it, they really need to know it's there. So let's get the word out. Let's make people aware that SOBS exists and it's there to help and support people. Now, it has been quite an emotional episode today, so if you have been affected by any of the issues discussed, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm at widowed_AF on Instagram, and you can also reach out directly to Josie at SOBS. But for now, it is a goodbye from me. A massive thank you once again, Josie, for being so open and talking about your personal experience alongside the work that you're doing. I'm really, really touched that you felt able to do so with me. So yeah, goodbye from me, and to everybody else out there, you take care of yourselves. I'll be back with you next week. Thanks again, Josie.
Thanks, Rosie.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you think someone else may benefit from this, please do share. We'd also really appreciate a quick review. It helps more people find the show. Thank you again, and see you next time on Widowed AF.